Thank you all for joining us. Appreciate it very much. Um, for those of you, Denny, good to see you.
Good to see you, Dan.
I saw you on the porch the other day, and you and who were you sitting with? Brett, I think. But we've been going through the thesis that we've been looking at in the Borg and Crossan book, the first Paul. And simply stated, the thesis is that when you read the letters of Paul, as scholars have recognized for many years now, there are not only discrepancies in what Paul says, but also changes in style among the letters. And for a very long time, scholars following the historical critical method have determined that there are three classes of letters. The first are those that were actually written by Paul, the authentic letters. Then you have, well, I'll tell you, you know those pretty much: 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Galatians, Philemon, Romans, and 1 Thessalonians, all authentic. Then there are the disputed letters, and the ones that we're speaking about there are Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians. And then finally, you have the, for lack of a better term, inauthentic letters. But as these are written chronologically, the closer you move into toward and into the second century, you see what is called a de-radicalization of Paul. Paul's original letters have a very radical view of a rather radical Christian worldview that is based on eschatology, radical egalitarianism among men and women, among the classes, among Jews and Greeks. But as we move towards the later letters, especially when we get towards 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, you see a change in the hierarchy back to the Roman way, we might call it. So that helps explain a lot, really, about our world. We talked a little bit about hierarchy in marriage, and it's no coincidence that some of the more conservative interpreters of Scripture rely upon those later inauthentic letters of Paul to uphold a very what is deemed a traditional understanding of marriage and understanding of the roles of men and women. It's really interesting when we use that term traditional. It's thrown around quite a bit, but there's nothing that's traditional about the authentic Paul. He's really taking a lot of assumptions to task, assumptions in the Roman world, as well as, in a much smaller circle, assumptions in the Jewish world. But he didn't start out that way, and that's where we're picking up. We looked at chapter 3 last time and looked briefly at the early life of Paul and some of the advantages that he had. He grew up in a very diverse city, Tarsus, where people were accustomed, because of the geography, to work hard, and holding back the ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, and of course the marshes there. He was influenced by his Jewish education, as well as education that he would have received as a citizen, a Roman citizen, some classical training. But one disadvantage, and this was something that was new to me, Crossan and Borg suggests that because of the geography and because of the marshes, you had a lot of mosquitoes in this area. And we know that mosquitoes carry malaria. And at the time, malaria was, of course, malaria can kill you, but it's also a disease that can be chronic over time and that can come and come upon you in fits and starts, to the point of completely disabling you. So you're not thinking straight. So your body is racked in paroxysms, shaking, and things like that. And Crossan and Borg state the hypothesis that there's something peculiar in Paul's letters where he talks about a thorn in the flesh. that has, that has kept him humble, kept him from being bragging or taking pride in some of his righteousness as a Christian, you might say. He's always reminded of this human aspect that he simply calls a thorn in the flesh. And Crossan and Borg make the argument that this thorn in the flesh may have been the bouts of malaria that he succumbed to oftentimes, and often had to call on the service and the help of the churches that he founded. And he makes a reference to this, an oblique kind of reference in Galatians. Last time I was with you, you really had to help me out because I was in rough shape. We don't know what was going on, but he was not well. So any thoughts about the malaria? I think that's an interesting thesis that Crossan and Borg suggests, one that I'd never heard before I had read this book several years ago, but it's an interesting one.
Question?
Yeah, go ahead.
The thorn in the flesh is in 2 Corinthians, which you classed as a debatable letter.
No, 1st and 2nd Corinthians is authentic.
I'm sorry.
It's 2nd Thessalonians.
Got it.
I may have said 2nd Corinthians if I misspoke.
No. I probably got it wrong. It's okay. Got it.
But for review, the disputable letters are Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians. So,
okay.
Well, chapter 3 is broken up into sections of Paul's life, and we know more and more about Paul's life the further we get into his conversion on the road to Damascus. There's this little section on that Borg and Crossan write about, entitled "Between Tarsus and Damascus." So we first hear about Paul. Actually, he's in Jerusalem and he's persecuting Christians. And Borg and Crossan want us to know, what more specifically can we determine about Paul, just based upon the early understanding that we have of him and what he says about himself, and also what Luke says about him in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, one of the threads that kind of winds its way through this tapestry is a comparison that Borg and Crossan make between what Paul says on the one hand, or what Paul infers in his letters on the one hand, and what Luke says about Paul's missionary journeys in the Acts of the Apostles. The letters would have been written somewhere between just roughly 50 and 60 of the Common Era. The Acts of the Apostles much later, probably 80. And we see some discrepancies in terms of, I don't want to call them facts, but the claims that are being made about who Paul was and what he did and what his missionary journeys. When we read Luke, sometimes it doesn't match up with Paul. But what we do know is that he was a very zealous Pharisaic Jew, schooled in the school of Gamaliel. Gamaliel was one to be known as more progressive among the Pharisees. He was also a Roman citizen, and this was an example where Luke and Paul seem to differ. Paul never mentions this himself. Luke, however, the entire last 10 chapters of Acts, and that's roughly where it happens, is premised on the idea that Paul is a Roman citizen and thus entitled to rights of fair trial that all Roman citizens are entitled to. So he goes from tribunal to tribunal and eventually on his way to Rome. And Luke suggests that Paul says, "Oh, wait a minute now, you can't just hang me out to dry the way you do a commoner here. I'm a Roman citizen." And so he appeals to this citizenship for his rights. But when we read Paul never really emphasizes that. In fact, he, if anything, downplays it, as we see on page 68, and I talked about that last time. But then this is where we'll pick up the point that we really want to make here is, what was it about this Pharisaic Jew from Tarsus, ostensibly a Roman citizen, that so offended him that he described himself as a zealous persecutor of Christians. Now, the word zeal in the first century Jewish context has a lot of baggage that comes with it. So Paul isn't just choosing any adjective here. There was a group of political activists known as zealots, of which one of Jesus' disciples was one. These were people who wanted to knock the Romans out of Jerusalem and take over Jerusalem once again. So they had a very strong zeal for the law and for Jewish identity, not unlike what we see in Israel today. So that kind of zeal is what Paul has in mind, not so much the political, but a zeal for, I don't want to have to deal with Roman law. The law that is the most important, the law that is the only one that I should have to acknowledge is Jewish law. And holding fast to that obligation was what Paul was all about. So what was it then about these followers of Jesus that so incensed Paul? If we read about it in the Acts of the Apostles, we know that Paul was in Jerusalem and believed to have been present at the stoning of Stephen. Stephen is the person, and the coincidence here is not coincidental. Stephen is the person who really lays out in one of the early chapters of Acts, what we might call salvation history, how God gives the law to the Jews and chooses the Jews to be a blessing to the world, but then they reject God's only son, and that's what causes Stephen to be stoned. Paul is present at that stoning, an indication of his zeal. And then there's a story that's told that one of the high priest in Jerusalem gave him orders to go up to Damascus and warn the synagogues there about these crazy Christians, which is dubious, because the high priest in Jerusalem would have nothing, no real authority with, any type of religious authority in Damascus, and Morgan Cross and bring up that point. But they summarize Paul's concern and his zeal in this way on page 69. That's the second full paragraph. What was so wrong with Christian Judaism, or at least the part that concerned Paul, that made him launch a lethal persecution against it? We can only conjecture, but here is our best reconstruction. Some Christian Jews claim that the awaited eschatological era was already present. That, in other words, the kingdom of God's divine transformation of the world from one of violent injustice to one of nonviolent justice had already begun. Therefore, they concluded, these Christians, Gentiles could now become full members of the people of God without following Jewish conversion requirements. For example, circumcision for males. Paul began as an opponent of this belief, but was converted to being a proponent of exactly the same belief. He went from persecuting those proposing open Gentile inclusion to becoming its major missionary advocate. And we see this in the next couple of sections when Paul has, what's known as the Jerusalem Council, a meeting with the apostles in Jerusalem, and it's decided there, depending on who you're reading, of course, that Paul would be the missionary to the Gentiles. And there were also questions that were being asked. If Gentiles want to become part of this movement, this ostensibly Jewish movement, right? Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, then should they have to go through circumcision? That was kind of a big deal at the time, right? Or can they just pass go and collect $200 and just go right into this transformed kingdom of God, focused on nonviolent justice? Circumcision is a pretty violent entree into a cultural community. And Paul argued against the circumcision. He also argued against kosher eating for Gentiles. So this was a real radical Paul that we're talking about. Radical with respect to his relationship with the Roman Empire, and radical especially with respect to his relationship with the traditional Judaism from which he came. So I wanted to conclude with that quote. That's where we left off last time, and begin with Paul's destiny at Damascus. And we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the course, or at the beginning of this class, when we were waiting for our books to arrive. I spent some time just going over Paul's life, so I hope this won't be too much of redundancy. But again, when we talk about Paul's conversion, and we went over this several weeks ago, the story Luke tells and the story Paul tells are really quite different. So I think this is the third section of chapter 3, beginning around page 69. The story we know comes from Luke, and I would argue that the story we know comes more from Christian art history and paintings that we've observed in the past. There are famous paintings. The one that I'm thinking of is by Caravaggio, of Paul and his conversion, being struck and blinded by a light, and he hears a voice, and he's thrown from his horse. And after having seen that painting so many times, you almost read it into the text, but there's no horse in the text at all, right? For all we know, Paul was on his way walking. But this conversion story is told 3 times in the Acts of the Apostles, and inconsistently so. But we hear from Luke that Paul heard the voice of Jesus, and he saw a light. And in the other 2 stories, his companions either heard the voice in one rendition or they saw the light in another rendition. It's not entirely consistent. But this according to Luke. Now, this is Luke writing in Acts, Acts chapter 9, and I think then later than 20 and 22, those chapters. But he never sees Jesus himself. He just hears a voice, which is curious, right? Because especially with the emphasis that we put upon the risen body of Christ, this is, if anything, a kind of a transcendental mystical experience that Paul is having. And Paul even makes reference to a mystical experience in 2 Corinthians. But when you hear Paul talk about the conversion experience on the road to Damascus, he actually sees Jesus, as Borg and Crossan point out. And it's this seeing of Jesus, this beholding him visually, that Paul claims that makes him one of the apostles. It's Jesus himself who sends him out. Now, this has ramifications for how Luke sees Paul and how Paul sees himself, right? Because if we read Luke, when Luke refers to the apostles, he's always referring to them as one of the 12. And the 12 being, the Barsabbas, who is the one who was added after Judas was, after Judas' passing. But Luke uses the 12 specifically to refer to those apostles that were with Jesus who received his commission. Paul, on the other hand, regarded himself as an apostle. And, when you read 1 Corinthians, he kind of used the designation of apostle rather loosely, because he said there are many, many more apostles as well. Let me just read this section to you. Naturally, I didn't pick it out in time, but I'll do it very quickly. Chapter 15, verses 5 through 9. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, Peter, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. So we can presume if Paul considers himself, one of the last of the apostles, then those 500 to whom Jesus appeared were also considered by Paul to be apostles. So it seems some discrepancy between what Luke regards as an apostle and what Paul regards as an apostle. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions about this. Yeah, go ahead, Penny.
But I want to make sure others can talk first. I always have questions, but this is your class.
Well, you know what? Sometimes we don't have many questions, so I welcome your question.
Well, I guess I've always understood, just looking at commentaries when I've preached on this often at Easter, that this is an early recital, I guess you'd say, a kind of pattern that he's repeating. So
Right.
It's passed on in the early church. And I guess as I just look at it right now, I don't know Greek and I'm not reading Greek. I'm not so sure he sees the 300 as an apostle, as apostles, but rather that he says, James, then to all the apostles. And I think, aren't those the 12? Or you think it also includes the 300? I wasn't.
This is the point that Borg and Crossan are making,
Oh,
that Paul is, it's very questionable. You're raising a good question, but if Paul is the least of the apostles, and we know that he's not part of the 12, then the argument can be made that the 12 aren't exclusively the apostles, as Luke makes them out to be. That many people can be apostles if Paul considers himself as one of these as well, a cult. Now, this becomes interesting because who is Paul sent out by? Is Paul sent out by Christ, or is he sent out by the church in Antioch, and thus he understands himself to be an apostle in that respect? We know that he and Barnabas are sent out on their, what Borg and Crossan call the second missionary journey, but which is traditionally referred to as the first missionary journey. But all of this to say that there's some discrepancy here, that Luke is drawing on a tradition that doesn't really match up with what we see in the authentic letters of Paul himself. Are there any other questions?
Dan?
Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, when we talk about Luke, which Luke are we talking about? Because on page 64, Borg and Crossan make it very clear that the scribe who is named Luke, to the scribe for Paul, who wrote down much of this, not the same person that wrote the gospel or the Acts. What could you clarify that?
Well, it's an open question. I remember them saying that as well. It's pretty clear that if that Luke were actually following Paul around, then his story in Acts would be much more consistent with Paul, right? So Luke is a Gentile name, and there's a lot of tradition that has developed around Luke as well. He's a physician, he's a Gentile. We assume that he was the Luke who followed Paul. In fact, there's a place, I think they're in Troas, they're in present-day Turkey, and Paul hears a voice saying, "Come over to Macedonia and preach to us." And then all of a sudden the narrative turns into, "And we went over," this first person plural narrative where it was in a third person before. And so the assumption is that Luke, who wrote the Gospels, was the Luke that followed Paul around. However, much like Paul's letters are not all attributable to Paul himself, Luke, the author of Acts, most likely is not the Luke referred to who followed Paul around, because it's written much later. It's written good 25 years after, after Paul was executed, which happened in about 62, and we date Luke to around 85 or so.
Dan, does the adjective zealous link him to the zealots necessarily? I've never understood that connection, and you think it does?
No, not necessarily. I just wanted to use that term as a kind of a trigger, right? And I think we call them triggers now. That I wasn't trying to suggest that Paul was one of the violent zealots, but as the zealots had a zeal for the law that led them to sacrifice their lives, so Paul had a zeal for the law.
Okay.
It didn't make him one of the zealots, but it was something that, this is a hardcore Jewish Pharisee right here. And he wasn't going to, take any lip from these, these Christians, right? Any other comments? Joyce Orr has been trying to get, there's Joyce.
I'm grateful to Sharon. Bless her.
Sharon let you in somehow or helped you out?
Somehow she helped.
Yeah. Mac, do you have anything to add to this? I always like to hear your thoughts because you've done a lot of reading on this.
All I would add, this kind of goes back to Denny's point on authorship. I've always been persuaded by those who take the view that with respect to the authors of the Gospels, we know basically a little bit about who they were not. The cute line in Jesus Christ Superstar where he has the disciples singing, "Then when we retire, we can write the gospel so they'll all got us when we die." If you remember that, we know that the disciples did not write the gospels. Beyond that, what you really have to say is we don't know a single stinking thing about any of them. And there are traditions like the physician tradition, but scholarship really doesn't know anything about the authors. And in fact, in the cases we discussed with the authorship of John, how many authors might have been involved in that enterprise? So
yeah,
that's kind of where I've come down for a long time on the authorship.
And there's another tradition that's associated with Luke that you would know if you're in the Roman Catholic Church, and that Luke is the person who painted the first portrait of Mary, supposedly. It just these. So how much emphasis you want to put into that? I think it's probably as plausible as anything else that has been spoken about Luke as well. But these traditions certainly have a historical and cultural context. You can read Luke and pick up on certain themes that give us an indication of at least what the community that produced this gospel was concerned with. And with Luke, it is that Jesus is the Messiah to the Gentiles. He has concern for the poor and the outcast. In Luke 4, Jesus announces his ministry by appealing to Isaiah 62, the God has called me to release the captives and give sight to the blind, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. So we should probably always, instead of talking about individuals, talk about the Lucan tradition or the Matthean tradition or the Markan tradition. We have the benefit of historiography, but we also have the disadvantage of thinking that any story we read that is authoritative is historical. and that the person who wrote it was trying to write history. And that is so far from the truth. All of us have to unlearn that when we come to the Bible, because history is certainly a modern invention as it's at least practiced and written. Well, any other thoughts? Good to see you, by the way, Joyce.
Thank you. Well, it's glad to finally be able to get on. I think that I'm in the middle of mountains, and I think it's the strength isn't as strong as it should be. So
Sure.
maybe that's changed. Hope
Uh,
so.
Are you enduring the weather? Of course, you're up
Not very well.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
I walk around 5 o'clock in the morning because it's just too hot the rest of the day.
Yeah.
But we're not Phoenix, so thankfully.
Yeah. Well, we also earlier spoke about the Nabatean mission. There's a very, very peculiar part of Paul's life that after his conversion, there's some evidence that he spent 14 years away. We don't know where exactly he was, but at least 3 years. He makes this reference, 2 or 3 years in the place called Nabatea, or in present day Jordan, near a city called Petra. And there was a king there by the name of Aretas IV. And we know that Paul, deeming himself an apostle, one who set out, went there to preach, and didn't have any success at all. I mean, talk about the work of the Holy Spirit, just not really pulling through for him. And Borg and Crossan, two things that are curious about this. They actually want to acknowledge this as Paul's first missionary journey. And they were, and in the education that I've had, the first missionary journey is traditionally referred to as the one that he takes with Barnabas, from Antioch into the Galatia area of Galatia. But this is a missionary journey, according to Borg and Crossan, that just failed. And we have to ask the question, why is there such silence on this? Except Paul, throws this little tidbit in here. Then after 14 years, he says. So we get the sense that he had a conversion somewhere around 36 of the Common Era. And then somewhere, about 14 years later, 35, 36 of the Common Era, 14 years later, he is called out of Tarsus by Barnabas to come down to Antioch and then go on a missionary journey. And there he is sent almost as Barnabas's, really sidekick, you might say. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But why this lack of success in the area of the Nabatean mission that we're talking about here, present day Petra, an area that is predominantly Muslim today. I don't think any of you have been to Petra, I've asked that before. But remember how the Roman Empire is set up. They had, especially in the area known as Judea, there were what were called tetrarchies that each had their king, and the king of the area known as Galilee was Antipas, who was the son of Herod the Great. So when we read the gospel and we hear about Herod the Great who lived when Jesus was born, this is not the same Herod who once the head of John the Baptist. That's his son. But across the Jordan River, there was another area. It wasn't called a tetrarchy, but it was another region that had its own king as well, by the name of Aretas IV. And as was common at this time, the kings would marry the daughters of other kings and create economic and political alliances that kept them strong. Well, so that was the case with Herod Antipas, who married the daughter of Aretas IV, whose name eludes me now. Does anyone happen to remember what her name was?
You mean
Well,
you mean the one who wanted John the Baptist's head?
no,
Salome?
the first wife of Herod Antipas, not the second. Yeah. Well, way leads on to way, of course, and Herod Antipas has a brother who is married to a woman named Herodias,
Okay.
and you might remember the story just kind of in an ancillary way. He what's the right word? He dismisses his first wife, the daughter of the king of Nabatea that we've been talking about, the daughter of Aretas the fourth, and he marries his brother's his brother's wife, basically Herodias. Now, Herodias was a Hasmonean princess. In other words, she had strong Jewish roots. She was not, part of the the Nabateans were not Jews necessarily. But she had a kind of a pedigree that went back hundreds of years in something known as the Hasmonean dynasty among the Jews. And it's this woman, Herodias, that we hear about in the story of John the Baptist, where Herod Antipas, is got a banquet going on. And he invites his daughter, Salome, who's pictured here in this image, to dance for them. And he says, I'll give you anything, you've danced so well, I'll give you anything you want. And then Herodias goes and whispers in her ear, tell him to bring me the head of John the Baptist. And Salome says, okay, Father, if you're going to be true to your word, bring me the head of John the Baptist. And this is how John was beheaded. Well, the reason John was being so, I guess, upset about this, and the reason that John was imprisoned by Antipas was that he was really calling this ostensibly Jewish king, which he really wasn't, just a name only, to follow the law. Look, you can't divorce somebody and then marry your brother's wife. That is against, the Jewish law. It's not kosher, so to speak. Well, Herodias wanted nothing to do with this. She felt like, she was being, disrespected. She's a Hasmonean Jewish princess, after all. No, prophet out in the desert is going to tell me what to do. So she has John the Baptist's head brought on a platter. Well, what does this have to do with the Nabatean mission? Well, meanwhile, Aretas the fourth, while Antipas is married to Herodias, finds himself slighted as well. And he says to himself, I'm not going to let that upstart, outrank me here. And so conflict arises between the Tetrarchy of Galilee under Antipas and then the Nabatean area under Aretas. And so there was warfare that was going on. Precisely at the time of this warfare, Paul, for some reason, goes into enemy territory and begins preaching and is not successful at all. And finally, he's run out of town. He could have been easily killed because he was seen as an enemy, and so this is a really interesting hypothesis that Borg and Crossan bring up, and one that you don't really hear about. I mean, but this is two scholars bringing to bear their extensive understanding of the archaeology, the history, the culture of the first century, and giving us little insights into something that many Christians really pay no attention to. How many Christians do you know that Paul had an unsuccessful mission, in the first years after his conversion? So the king's daughter was scorned for Herodias. In the midst of that conflict, Paul goes down to Petra, and there in that city has no success whatsoever, and then runs back to Tarsus, presumably with his tail between his legs, and stays there for 14 years until Barnabas comes and gets him. And thus begins the next section of his life. that is entitled in our chapter, The Crypto-Galatian Mission. Any thoughts about that? Or I know I probably spent a little more time on that story in John the Baptist, but it is an interesting story. And frankly, I think it is attested by Josephus.
Oh, it is Josephus. I was going to ask you what the source was. It's Josephus?
Yeah,
Okay. Because it's certainly not in the Gospels or Luke. or
no,
Matthew.
no. But this is one of the things that the historical critical method is so good at is they don't just look at the internal sources. They also look at the external sources, who was writing about this at the time. And this was in Josephus as well. And I can't remember if it's the Jewish War or the Antiquities of the Jews. I'm going to guess the Jewish Wars. So we find out in Acts chapter 14 that now this is in Acts chapter 9, Paul has his conversion. And then there's some discussion of Paul in Damascus, and eventually in Acts 12 or 13, I don't have it in my head, he is going to be sent out with Barnabas on a mission under the auspices of the church in Antioch. Antioch, by the way, is the town in present-day Syria that just experienced that horrendous earthquake. And they have another name for it. Anybody remember what the Arab name for Antioch is Antaka or something. I'm sorry, I don't know that. But you might remember the story that we talked about earlier when Barnabas and Paul are sent out, and they're going into the area known as Galatia, which is in really present-day Turkey. And their missionary journey really focuses on that area. And there's a missionary strategy that is very clear when you look at the map. And Borg and Crossan want to bring that to light. But you might remember in Acts chapter 14 that we discussed this, that Paul was preaching and Barnabas was with him. And the people who heard them preach there in, Greco-Roman Galatia were just wowed out. And they said, my goodness, let's bow down and worship these guys. This has to be Zeus and Hermes. And Zeus, of course, was Barnabas. And Hermes was, they felt that Paul was Hermes. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, suggesting that, that there was some aspect of the hierarchy there. Zeus is higher than Hermes. Why would it be that Zeus would be attributed to Hermes or mistaken for Hermes or excuse me, why would it be that Barnabas would be mistaken for Zeus and Paul for Hermes? And Crossan and Borg suggest that this indicates the hierarchy of that mission. It wasn't Paul and Barnabas, it was Barnabas and Paul. Paul was like an apprentice to Barnabas on this mission. This is at least the implication. But there's one thing that Borg and Crossan point out that I think is really, that I'm really grateful for having learned this on this second reading of the book. When we look at Barnabas's mission strategy and we compare it to Paul's, it's very different. Barnabas would go on the road, literally on the Roman roads, and go to the synagogues first, and there preach the Gospels. And this is what Luke has Paul do in the Acts of the Apostles. Paul goes to these towns and goes to the synagogues first, right? Borg and Crossan suggest that this becomes Luke's model. Luke really has no firsthand experience of what Paul actually did. But he did have a tradition at his disposal based upon Barnabas's missionary strategy. Follow the Roman roads, go to the synagogue. So lo and behold, what does Luke in Acts have Paul do? Basically follow the Roman roads, but more specifically, go into the synagogues and preach the gospel there. Well, this really is contrary to how Luke saw himself as an apostle. He was an apostle to the Gentiles. So what was, if he was going into the synagogues, what was he doing there? The point that Borg and Crossan want to make, though, is that we get suspicious of the missionary journeys as laid out by Luke when we read them and compare them to the letters of Paul. It appears that Luke is fashioning Paul's missionary journeys on the model of Barnabas. And I have that quote on page 79 that I'd like to read. So Luke, the author, is talking about Barnabas as the model for his depiction of Paul's missionary journeys. In other words, and I'm reading the first paragraph on page 79, Luke takes Barnabas's mission and what Paul did when he was under Barnabas as a model for what Paul always did, even when he was by himself. Luke filled out his lesser knowledge of Paul on his own with his greater knowledge of Paul under Barnabas. Luke had access to traditions about Paul and Barnabas. He did not have access to traditions, or not the same access to traditions about Paul on his own. So what he did is he filled out those traditions with the model that that he had close at hand. But is that what Paul did when he was on his own independent mission? And first of all, how did he finally gain that independence? So here's the question. At some point, Barnabas and Paul split ways. What was the reason for that splitting? Why is it that Paul went out on his own? And here's where we see another comparison of Paul's letters and the Acts of the Apostles, and it all comes to head as something known as the Jerusalem Council, which most scholars have dated somewhere around 48 or 49 of the Common Era. And you can read about this in Acts, I believe it's Acts chapter 15. Any questions about this before we move on?
Dan,
Yeah, Denny.
what source material did Luke, the author of the Acts of the Apostles, have when he was setting about to write the Acts of Paul? This is a thing that's always been a puzzle to me. There's about a 30-year gap in there. Was
Right.
it oral? Was it written down in Greek?
Well, remember, this is really, you're asking a very complex question. First of all, the first generations of Christians probably relied upon oral tradition. Why? Well, because they thought the world was going to end soon. When you write books for posterity, right? We don't have time to be right. We don't need no books, we need to get the word out. But then when the Jerusalem temple fell in 70 of the Common Era, and the world did not come to an end, because here the Christian community is thinking, well, if it's going to be any time, it's going to be this. Look, the Jewish temple has just been destroyed. Christ must be returning. He didn't return. Well, the church had grown quite a bit at that time, and they were starting to preach different things about who Jesus was. So leaders in the church said, we probably should write down some of these traditions before everything just goes haywire, right? And so they write down some of the oral traditions that they probably drew upon. And this, it's been hypothesized, was the reason for the writing of the book Q, what scholars call Q, this source of sayings of Jesus. And then much later on, when those sayings of Jesus needed a little bit more context, then the narratives came about. And so you have Mark writing his narrative, and then you have Luke, and then you have, Matthew writing theirs, and then finally John writing his narrative. But as we've already seen, even those narratives have a lot of discrepancy in their understanding of Jesus. So when we talk about Luke writing about Paul, who, you know, who was writing 40 years ago, what Borg and Crossan are saying is that Luke probably had access to traditions that had their source in the Antiochian church. In Antioch, the place from which they set out on their first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas, a tradition, an oral tradition, or perhaps even a written tradition arose. But after that, probably up to, you know, the return of Paul and Barnabas to Antioch from whence they came, Luke didn't have anything. So what he did, he probably fashioned together, you know, his knowledge of maybe letters of Paul. He probably had access to those, but or at least to Pauline traditions. And he probably I hate to use the word fabricated, but he probably, in order to keep his narrative consistent, he probably wrote a narrative about Paul going to his other churches, Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, Ephesus. Actually, the original ones would have been Philippi, Corinth, Thessalonica, and then the letter to the Galatians in there, and then finally to Rome. But he didn't have a travel narrative. And what he did is he used the model of the Barnabas mission to fill in the travel narrative that he did not have about Paul. Does that make sense, Denny, or anybody else?
It's very, very creative.
Yes.
Yeah, and we don't like to think of the Bible as being creative, do we? Or the product of a creative process. We like to think
Very
of it,
creative.
yeah, as having dropped from the heavens and thus authoritatively so. Any other comments about this?
Dan, we know that oral tradition is very susceptible to misinterpretation, mistranslation, passing the old kind of parlor game of passing it on, what you hear.
Sure.
So by the time it gets to Luke 30 years later, that might, account for a little bit of the discrepancy between Acts and what the letters of Paul.
Well, another thing to keep in mind here too is that oral tradition was very strong in the Jewish faith, and they actually had kind of rhetorical skills that kept their oral tradition alive. You can still see, sometimes when you will see Orthodox Jews praying, they'll be kind of bobbing back and forth. I think that originally originated with the meter of the Hebrew language that was written in such a way, I shouldn't say written, that originated in such a way that the meter allowed them to memorize their oral tradition. And so you've had this experience, I'm sure, where you're driving along in your car and you hear a song from the 1960s that you haven't heard for 50 years or 60 years, and you're singing along with it. And it's just like, how in the world do I remember those lyrics, right? Well, because the music and the meter and the beat and all of that, the rhythm is a device that helps you remember that. And thus in the Jewish tradition, you had this. Now, Luke, being a Gentile, would have come out of the Greco-Roman tradition where writing was much more commonplace, right? And rhetoric was something that was more intellectual than lyrical, you might say. I mean, not that the two are at odds with each other. So Luke probably, there's something of the Greco-Roman world that probably brought about the writing down of these Gospels after the fall of the Jewish temple. When the Jewish Christian churches started to fade away, and the Gentile churches, having been raised in the Greco-Roman world, started to be in the majority, that's when some of these things may have been written down. So, I mean, it's just fraught with mystery. We can only conjecture, and that's why that term is used quite frequently with Borg and Crossan, Oh my gosh, the time's already upon us. I feel like I talk too much. Well, one thing I will ask you to do is there is, if you have your Bible, in Acts chapter 15, there's something known as the Jerusalem Council. Luke tells the story one way. Paul makes a reference to it in Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 14. Paul and Luke seem not to agree. Paul seems to suggest that he met with a couple of the guys and they all agreed upon this. Luke seems to suggest what this icon represents here, that there was a meeting of all the bishops, all of the churches came together and there was a great council meeting, which suggests an embellishment upon, on the part of the later
There
writer.
were bishops that early?
No, I shouldn't have said bishops.
Oh, no, but okay, yeah, because that's really later development. Go ahead.
Yeah. But the leaders who would later become bishops, we hear about them, the later writings of Paul. But leaders came together and decided on what the roles, what the role of Jewish theology was and what the place of Gentiles in this new church was going to be. The big question, hey, if you're going to convert to this new Christian faith, which arose out of Judaism, do you need to become Jewish first? The way you became Jewish in the Roman world is you became circumcised if you're a male. And that, as I've often said, that's not the best marketing strategy for growing a church, And so a lot of people were saying, nah, I think I'll pass on that. And so it became, why now, if we are in this new kingdom of God where everybody is accepted and circumcision is a mark that makes somebody exclusive to a religious group, well, shouldn't we be bypassing that exclusivity of circumcision? And the council did agree upon this, but they did not agree upon kosher eating. They wanted the Christians to be kosher when the Gentiles who became Christians, they wanted them to be kosher when they came into the church. And Paul disagreed with that. And so to the question, why did Paul and Barnabas separate? That's where the separation took place. Paul didn't believe kosher eating should be part of the Gentile conversion experience or Gentile baptism experience. All of the other apostles did. So when we return next time, I'll give you a little overview of that again and talk about the Jerusalem Council, which was really a watershed moment for the church, however it happened, according to Paul or according to Luke. So any final questions, Penny? As always, a pleasure seeing you and hearing from you. Any other questions before we move on? Well, thanks, everyone. We're at about page 80 or so in our text. If you want to avail yourself of, we're going to be looking at this section titled the Aegean Mission. But if you want to read Galatians chapter 2, 1 through 14, and then maybe the Jerusalem Council in Acts, which I think is chapter 15. I hope so.
It is 15.
Yeah, 15. And compare those and become your own little historical critical scholar, then we can do that when we return next time.
One of my questions for not now, but later is why did the Catholics began, did they not, in claiming the apostolic tradition that they believe their entire church continues, that forces many of us Protestants also to reinterpret that phrase?
Yeah.
Obviously, if Paul's recitation of all the other entities could be considered apostles, I'd never thought of that.
Yeah.
But at some
Right.
point, I'd like to understand how that became such a norm.
Well,
I know the UCC grabs it and reinterprets it. I assume the Presbyterians do too.
yeah, it's the confession of Peter that is the apostolic tradition. Now, the Catholic Church says, no, it is the person of Peter and the actual handing down from Peter to the next that defines the apostolic tradition. But yes, we can talk about that when we return because our time is with us now. Thanks, everybody. This is a highlight of my week. I really enjoy these conversations.